Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this dreary Wednesday afternoon for one of our Good Employment Charter webinars. The focus of today's session is on employee voice and engagement, so we know that that's going to be a really interesting topic for many of you, particularly at this present time. Before I start, I just need to go through a few housekeeping notifications. For those of you that haven't used webinars before, or the live storm, we do tend to find that it works best if you have Google Chrome. So hopefully if you have that platform, then you'll have a good experience with it. For anybody that might have any audio or video issues during the transmission, if you just refresh your page, that should hopefully rectify any issues that you have. But fingers crossed, everything will go smoothly. In terms of questions, we do encourage you to ask them because we've got a good panel here with us today. So if you could use the questions tab that's to the right hand of your screen, that would be fantastic. And what we'll do is we'll pick those up as we go along. But what we'd also encourage you to do is, as usual, use the chat function, introduce yourselves, introduce yourselves to us and to other colleagues that are getting involved today as well. And that's just quite a nice way of us knowing who's here and what kind of issues you might have as well. But also, because we can't meet in person anymore, it is still a good way to network with each other, which obviously we're quite keen for you all to do. For those colleagues that might want to share this transmission, this recording afterwards, it is recorded and it will be uploaded onto YouTube. But what we'll also do is to make sure that it gets sent out to all of our supporters as well. So we're just conscious that at the moment it's holiday period and quite a few people are not around. But obviously this is a topic that I think a lot of people would be very interested in because it's quite a generic and wide-ranging issue. So by way of an introduction, just to start off this webinar, as you know, one of the key characteristics of good employment is about ensuring effective engagement and voice. And without a confident and empowered workforce that can express and share their opinions safely, an organisation will benefit in terms of innovation, but it also enables an organisation to build what is a cohesive and a very inclusive workplace that's based on trust. And as a result of that, you would expect it to be much more productive. So as we begin to reopen our economic activity and we start to adjust to living with COVID-19, because it's obviously going to be around for some time yet, effective employee engagement is going to be critical in ensuring that workplaces can function effectively. But those workplaces are going to need the support and the voice of their staff. So ensuring that effective employee engagement is still at the heart of good employment, we need to look at ways to make sure that, given the current challenges that we have, the fact that we are still social distancing, we've got a workforce that's quite often dispersed, people working in very, very different kind of environments than they were before. We have got a number of challenges that are going to be presented to us over time. And we are going to have to start thinking differently. And some of you have already done that in terms of how we work. And that's going to mean thinking, innovatively and creatively and looking at good practice that other people are using and, other ideas that people might have. So we're absolutely delighted today that we've got a fantastic panel that can hopefully help us and guide us through some of those discussions. So in terms of our panel membership today, I'll just introduce everybody. So if our panel members can just raise their hand or a little wave when I introduce them, that would be fantastic. So we have Jay McKenna, and Jay is the Acting Regional Secretary for the TUC. So obviously got a very keen interest in employee voice. We've got Terry Duffy, who is the Northwest Director for Acas. Again, lots of experience and expertise here. We've got Michael Brennan, who is the CEO and founder of an organisation called Tootoot. So some of you that might have come across, educational institutions whilst working with apprenticeships or study programme learners, for example, may well have come across Tootoot, but Michael's here to talk at it from a different perspective in terms of getting that employee feedback. And also we have Anusree Saha-Williams, who is the Comms and Engagement Manager from Bruntwood. And Anusree is going to give us her perspective today from an employer's vantage point. So obviously we'll get some really, really interesting points from everybody. So I'm going to kick off with the first question, just to kind of open up some discussion. I'm going to come to Jay first of all. So Jay, obviously kind of working with the TUC, employee voice is obviously a key passion of yours. So could you just outline for us the role that trade unions have in supporting employers to better understand the concerns and the needs of their employees?
Well, it will come of no surprise to anyone that I'll speak up for the importance of unions doing that, but also from a personal perspective. I was a trade union rep in 2 workplaces. I worked in a job centre and in the passport office, and I've worked in call centres, shops, and you kind of see that need for talking to management. It exists all of the time. Managers want to know what staff are thinking and feeling. They have planned changes they want to talk to staff about. A trade union is a very simple and direct way of doing it, really, and a trade union rep elected on behalf of members can go and speak to management and say this is what staff are thinking and feeling. And the benefit, I think, to that is when management are thinking about making a change, or when management are recognising there's an issue. Look at the current climate, COVID as an example. Staff, will have had big concerns. Employers will have had huge concerns. They'll have wanted to know what their staff are thinking and feeling. The trade union in lots of workplaces has been doing that, but has been working closely with management. I think sometimes our trade union understanding is characterised through often maybe what we see in the media and strikes and pay and pensions. When most trade union reps, they see getting to that point, and rightly so, as a failure of their work, that it's about talking to managers throughout and working with them. And my time as a trade union rep, and lots of others who are on this call, they spend more of their time just talking to management informally and formally, regularly and daily. And it's only now and again that there are those kind of flare-ups on bigger issues. And I think we often, using COVID as that example, we find that there are big areas of commonality. Staff have concerns about being safe in the workplace. Employers have concerns about their staff being safe too. They've been able to work together, and we've seen from lots of big organisations and from smaller ones, working together with their trade union, they've been able to come up with safe ways of working, come up with plans about paying staff while they're absent, coming up with sick pay policies for self-isolation, which Andy as Metro Mayor is speaking about regularly, and we're doing some work with them on that next week. Big concerns that staff have are often shared, and you can kind of have that with a trade union, with your trade union rep in a workplace, have that very direct conversation. And sometimes, the thing I've most found from that, again, from my personal experiences, even if you don't agree with sometimes what management are doing, you can appreciate and understand often why they're doing it. And lots of the real positive experiences I've had of that have been when it's been to say, well, it's less what you're trying to do here, it's how you're trying to do it. That might be the barrier, and how you communicate that, and how staff think and feel about it, and timing on some of these things. So that those kind of conversations, I think, are really beneficial. And just to say, there is a mutual benefit for staff to this. Sometimes it's seen as, trade unions want more from the employer. Well, trade unions don't exist if employers don't exist, because we have nowhere for people to work, so we have no trade union members. We want our workplaces where we have trade union membership to grow and be successful and thrive. And you see that, just as an example, across real big organisations. And that role is really important to manage the day-to-day stuff, but also to see it grow, so that, as the company grows, the workers benefit from that, whether it be through increased pay, but other things like increased training as well. And I think that's the dynamic we don't often see, that it's not always about, asking for more pay, but it's about, well, what does the workplace look like? How's it safe? How do we, maybe we do flexible working a bit better? How do we maybe access more learning? They're the other things that unions are doing all of the time that I think, are where there are big areas where, what management and what employers want crosses over with what staff and employees want as well.
No, that's really good. And I think you're right. I think it's great that you've mentioned there about some of the perceptions that people have of trade unions as well, Jay, because, it is quite obvious that you are doing a lot more work in terms of, listening. And like you've said, it's not about it's not about what you're trying to do, it's how you do it as well. And I think that's really useful in terms of people thinking about how you engage people to get some of those messages across. and not just looking at some of the traditional topics that trade unions have usually been associated with. So it's good to hear you're looking at things like isolation and, you know, working safely, etc. So if I move over to Terry, Terry, obviously not every organisation that's engaged with the Good Employment Charter is involved with a union. So what does good practice look like for a workplace that isn't unionised? Are there any examples of good practice that you could share with us, or you know, tips for people to take on board?
Yeah, certainly, Carol. I mean, and echoing some of the things that Jay's spoken about, when we're talking about employee voice, it can exist in many different forms, whether it's unionised, non-unionised, and some of the things that Jay was mentioned there about, you know, getting things right. Now, I spent 10 years before stepping into this current role, talking to all kinds of businesses, different sizes, different sectors, and many of those were coming from positions where there was a problem with voice in their organizations. And I think for me, best practice was recognizing that, first of all, that there was a gap, there was a need. And I think it strikes me that sometimes when we talk about voice, it's sometimes described in a way that it's a concession to employees, where we would advocate that it shouldn't be a concession, it should be an integral part of your business. It should be two-way communication, because without hearing the voice of your employees, you could have the best idea in the world, but if it's translated incorrectly or not communicated properly or misunderstood, that idea is not going to get off the ground. So we see it as something where organizations should be embedding it, and sometimes people talk about voice and replace it with the idea of engagement. And if you think about engagement terms, engagement is a connection, it's a two-way thing, and so should voice. But in terms of what best practice looked like, when in all of those discussions I was having with many businesses across the Northwest, it struck me that a one-size-fits-all approach very rarely is the right way to go. Organizations are very different in terms of their resources and their facilities, and in just their ordinary culture, and indeed where they might be starting from as well. And so I think the first thing to do is, if you're going to introduce anything, whether you've got a pre-existing model or whether you're looking to start and set up some kind of mechanisms within your workplace, it's to begin that journey jointly as well. Don't come along and turn around and say, here's one I've prepared, accept it for what it is. Do it together, shape it together, and I think then you get the buy-in from everybody, and it creates a positive endorsement of what you're trying to do. And in terms of the other features of what best practice could look like, and I mentioned about one size not fitting all, you're going to have different ways that voice can manifest itself, and that can be as simple as the relations between colleagues in an organization. It can be between line managers and their individual staff members. It can be the things that we sometimes need to get involved in, such as formal processes like grievances, but it could also be innovative approaches to how you might communicate good messages about quality and diversity and fair treatment in your workplace by setting up fair treatment contacts and ambassadors for fair treatment. So, you know, the landscape is limitless, really. But I think if you start from that point of view of seeing it as integral to your business, and then build your voice with the people in your business, whether that is with trade union colleagues or indeed in non-unionized environments, you're going to find something that works and is a fit for your organization.
I think that's a really good point, and it really emphasizes that kind of investment that if it's made right, in terms of engaging and listening and working jointly with your employees, you build that trust, don't you? And then that obviously then leads to a much happier workforce, who then become more productive, they become loyal, etc. So there's lots of benefits that are linked to that as well, aren't there? Which is great. Yeah. So Michael, you know, as we've kind of been working our way through this pandemic, and it's not as easy now for people to either get together, and you know, some of the traditional ways in which people have probably capture the employee voice are not happening so much now. In terms of the work that you do and the use of technology, how can you see, you know, what the technology helping people to look at new and innovative ways of capturing that employee voice and still retaining that trust?
Thanks, Carol. Yeah, for those that don't know what Tootoot does, we developed the world's first app that allowed children and young people to raise concerns and to measure the mental health and well-being of young people in the school environment. So it was providing that voice, that mechanism to do so. And throughout our journey over the last 5 years, we've worked in partnership with Wigan Council, Barclays Bank, they're global leaders of HR, well-being and engagement. And one thing that became very clear that resonates with Jay and Terry's point of view is it's about the mechanism. It's about connecting your individual employees, whether they're in an office, whether they're next to you, whether they're working remotely, globally, and enabling that voice to either be, from a team point of view, resonating a concern or a suggestion directly into the heart of your organization, to enable those that are in positions to review, measure, and support to do that easily and quickly via the HR team or the engagement team, and ultimately enable leadership to measure and monitor what those individuals are saying. So from our point of view, using technology, we mapped out what was in place already. So if you think about an organization, they tend to sandbox HR, engagement, well-being, psychological safety, health and safety. And then they push back down the channel of the employee to try and shoehorn employees' challenges into those shoeboxes. But the important part of what you need to do, or we feel, is providing a way for employees when they can't speak up face-to-face or they can't use other channels to report, such as EAP helplines, they have a way via an app or via a platform to raise a concern, but not just raise a concern, but to suggest an idea or to praise a colleague. It's just a digital model that provides that voice and that channel for someone on the front line to easily and frictionlessly speak up or to suggest something. And on the other side of that, looking back at kind of what is in place right now for most organizations, employee voice is measured and captured by an annual survey or a biannual survey or a quarterly pulse, which is lots of questions just done more frequently. But it's very, very difficult to get that information and feedback back, to measure that by team, by gender, by ethnicity. So you lose the element of inclusion, the diversity, and understanding of what your people want on the front line. So we, working with employees and employers, developed a platform called Strive, which very simply allows organizations to pulse out single questions in real time to the whole of the organization or to their teams directly into their inbox. And although that feedback is completely anonymous, it allows you to drill down by gender, ethnicity, department, so that you can start to make sure that your responses to your employees are both two-way, as Terry's saying, but equally it's not one size fits all. And supporting that model is you actually give the employees an employee voice mechanism, because that's one of the biggest things that's missed is how do you capture and measure the voice? And that's where technology is fantastic, because you can start to enable employees to raise a concern, for example, of I'm worried working remotely for my well-being. That starts the conversation. It's well and good that you can just get that bit of feedback of the what, but you can use technology through our system to measure the sentiment of that response, to see whether that was positive or negative. And you can compare that then to pull out the key phrases to see whether other employees are having the same challenges of missing support or colleague needing help or mental health issues. So as you suddenly build this framework out, whether you have 50 employees or 10,000 employees, you still make sure that every employee feels like they're being listened to. And that's really important. Trust is key. If you can build trust in a two-way communication and a mechanism, like Terry says, to actually listen and build with your organization, then absolutely your people will be set, and therefore your product and your process will align, and naturally your business will do great things. And I think that's our main mechanism of our organization. Technology enables the employee voice, but it's about bringing that model together with the employee and the leadership teams around that.
No, that's really interesting. And I think it's really interesting, or it would be interesting to look at the results of the kind of pulse surveys, because as an employer, it would be fascinating to see what trends are emerging over time, because I think, you know, anecdotally, you can see that while we've been working through this pandemic, one week you might feel absolutely fine, the next week something might trigger you feeling not so great, and trying to understand what those triggers are and being able to respond to them, you know, with some evidence would be really powerful, I think.
Absolutely, and that's the flexibility of technology like ours, is that you can pulse that single question to a different team or department, and you can measure over time. So you can absolutely now get a happiness index of your organization as a baseline. Or if week 2 is more severe than week 1, then you can do something about that to support your sales team or the team that are working remotely. So that targeted approach can come in organically without disrupting and affecting parts of the business. And what's really powerful is there'll be great parts of your business every single day, and there'll be challenging parts. So how do you utilize and know about those great parts and feed that back into the challenging parts? And that's missed without the use of technology, I feel, in an organization.
Yeah. Okay. So if I move on to Noose now, because you've been doing an awful lot of work within your organisation at Bruntwood to obviously engage with your workforce, and obviously you've had so many challenges over the past few months, like most employers in the country. So what are the techniques that you've been using, Noose, and how have you had to adapt those to cope with the situation that we're working through at the moment?
So I feel I'm going to repeat some of the benefits that Tootoot offer with things like pulse surveys and kind of the check-ins with the colleagues, because that's been hugely important for us over the last 4 months. I think pre-COVID, we thought that we were pretty good at amplifying colleague voices, but I think over the last 6 months in particular, we found that there's been a real shift, particularly from our leaders, in that there's a real appetite to hear more and to use a lot of the insight that that colleagues were sharing with us. So pre-COVID, as I said, I think we were quite traditional. We've got an intranet in place which all colleagues have got access to. It's very interactive, so people can react and comment and like the posts that we push out there. We ran an annual engagement survey, sort of probably more a traditional engagement survey than the one that we're planning on doing later this year. And we would also run a series of pulse surveys, but they were probably more project or program led. So if there was a specific program of work happening in the business, then we would go out for feedback on that specifically rather than asking for it on a continuous basis. The same with focus groups. And I think one of the big drivers of engagement in any business is the visibility and the authenticity of our leadership team. So we've tried to kind of, make sure that our leaders were visible. But pre-COVID, as any business, everyone had busy diaries, and it was always difficult to find the time to get the leaders to go out to see teams as much as they did want to. And then come March, everything kind of turned on its head a little bit, and not only did we have to really kind of transform the way that we operated the business. For those of you that don't know, Bruntwood runs around 110 properties across Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham and Leeds, and their office spaces and science districts as well. So our customers are obviously the people that are based in the offices. So we went through a process of having to kind of descale our teams based in our buildings, because obviously customers weren't coming into their offices, and we then had to set up remote working really quickly. And we found that because we were able to make these business decisions really quickly, there was then an appetite for the business to test and try new communication methods as well. So we probably launched more initiatives in the last 6 months than I've tried to push through in the last 2 years. So we ran pulse surveys pretty much every 2 weeks. We had 3 questions that we asked all the time, which was, how are you feeling at the moment? How would you rate your personal well-being and your mental health? How worried are you about the impact of COVID on the business, and how worried are you about the impact of COVID on your friends and family? So that we were getting that regular temperature check of how the business was feeling. And as was mentioned before, we found that certain weeks people were feeling better than others, and it tended to be in relation to what was going on in the news, but also the information that we were sharing as well. So we went through a process where we took advantage of the furlough scheme, and we also asked colleagues that remained in the business to take a 20% pay reduction, and we found that had a huge impact on the way that colleagues were feeling about the impact of COVID on them personally and the impact on the business. So we then knew that we kind of had to then ramp up a little bit of the communications to make sure that people understood that the business was still a viable business and very sustainable and fit for the future, but that we were just trying to safeguard jobs at the moment. And then we introduced a whole load of other initiatives that I think we're now in a position to repurpose as we go into, and I hate to use the phrase, the new normal. So some of the things that we did, we're going to continue with the regular pulse surveys. The ones that we ran during COVID, we ran them on quite specific topics so that we could use that colleague insight to inform what we were doing. So particularly around checking in with our furloughed colleagues to make sure that they felt supported and still felt connected to the business, and then particularly around the whole return to work process as well. So before we started thinking about what that programme of work would look like, we wanted to know what was important for colleagues. And then when we had our programme set up, we then ran it past colleagues as well to make sure that it kind of reassured them around safety, hygiene, social distancing, all of that, to make sure that they felt really comfortable that when they came back into work, they were coming back into a safe space. We also ran, again, using the likes of Zoom and Google Hangouts, we ran a load of sort of leadership sessions where colleagues could come and ask our leadership team any questions that they had. It was an open invitation to all colleagues, and they could ask any questions. So we got the difficult questions, are we going to survive the pandemic? Is the business financially robust? Through to what's our future business plan? Are there any opportunities for us to benefit from this? So our CEO held what we called a coffee morning every week, and we tended to have about 20 to 25 people join those each time. And then we had one of our board directors on call every evening between 6 and 7, and we pushed out their telephone number, and we just said to all colleagues, if you've got anything that you want to ask, just pick up the phone and speak to them. And we found that at the beginning they were getting bombarded with calls, and then as we got into the routine of regular communication, they knew where things were going, the numbers kind of dropped off. But I think, again, it was just the ability for us to go out to colleagues and say, we want to hear everything that you have to say. We need to know what's on your mind. We need to know what questions you've got, and we'll do our best to answer them. And if we can't, then we'll take it away and come back to you. And if you've got ideas and feedback, then we'll build it into our plans. And we also introduced an ideas and feedback platform as well, which has landed really well in the business. It was initially purposed for COVID, so send us any ideas on how we can make our places safe, send us any ideas on how we can support you coming back into work or support your health and well-being. But then also, if you've got any questions or any concerns that you want to raise, then you can submit it anonymously, and we can pick it up directly with you. So kind of over the next 3 months, really, we're doing a little bit of a lessons learned and a bit of a reflection on what we've done. And as I said, we're now repurposing a lot of those channels and those initiatives going forward. So the CEO coffee mornings, we had one last week, which was specifically about Black Lives Matter. So again, it was something that was kind of born out of COVID, but we're now using to kind of inform our D&I strategy. We're continuing with the pulse surveys as well, just checking in with colleagues. And we're looking at really one of our big priorities for this year is developing a real speak up culture so that colleagues feel really comfortable and confident that their voices are going to be heard and their action is going to be taken on the back of that.
That's great. And obviously you're doing so much work there. And I think the fact that you're obviously responding and acting on that feedback that you're getting from people, which obviously is instilling the confidence in your senior leadership team as well, which is what people need to see, because it's all well and good capturing the employee voice, but it's about doing something with that as well, isn't it? Which is critical.
Absolutely. And my favourite types of communications are always the ones that start off with "you told us, so we did." And we've been able to do that throughout this whole process, and I think we can absolutely 100% confidently say that our return to work process was absolutely informed by what colleagues told us. They gave us ideas, but they also raised what was important to them and what they were most concerned about. So we made sure that those were absolutely addressed to kind of give them that reassurance.
No, that's great. We've had some questions that have come in. So I'm going to go to Gemma's question first of all. So Gemma's question is, from your experience, what do you think is the most helpful, powerful or useful question to ask your employees regularly? So I don't know whether Terry, from your perspective, if there are any questions that you've come across that you've found to be powerful in terms of getting that feedback, and obviously, Nus and Michael, you've probably heard some as well recently from the pulse surveys and that you've been carrying out. And Jay, you must come across them all the time. So I suppose there's probably lots of different questions here, aren't there? There
is. I mean, and Noosh went through quite a lot, as well as Michael as well. So I mean, it doesn't. I mean, we should never tire of asking about people's well-being and inquiring. But I think we need to have a sophistication which perhaps sometimes goes beyond that, and sometimes I'm okay, if we got repetitive feedback of that could be instructive in telling us that people aren't okay. But I think another good question to always ask is, are we doing enough, or is there anything more that we could be doing? And again, it's this thing about this idea of jointness, and if I've got an idea of a good question or a good range of questions to ask, am I asking the right questions, and having some way in which that's looked at. And I think, you know, the whole idea of this as well is what do we do with the data as well? And I suppose there's got to be a landing space for that pulse survey data to come back and be analysed. And I suppose in terms of best practice of voice, I'd be looking and saying, well, there's got to be a mechanism where maybe that's not just management who are looking at that, but that's being looked at jointly. Because I could look at it one way as management, whereas members of different departments or the workforce might interpret and see it differently. And I think that's where we get the quality of analysis. And again, it's I like Noosh's point about let's not just all hold it where we've seen it, but that idea of we've heard you, this is what we're doing. And indeed, sometimes being a bit honest about things you haven't been able to do yet. Might encourage people to say, okay, the next time you ask, I might just ask again. So again, it's just been sophisticated in being persistent, and being responsive, and then building in that jointness to whatever analysis you do, and then sharing it back with people.
Yeah, I'd completely agree. I think in terms of, was there one question that we asked? We always ask the 3 questions in terms of our COVID pulse survey. So how are you feeling? The impact on your family and your friends, and then how worried are you about the impact on the business? And we found that, as I said, we found that kind of moved as we sort of went up and down as we went through the process. But again, I think that as you were saying earlier, we always made sure that we went out with the pulse survey results a week after the pulse survey closed, so that people could see and I think it's a little bit of reassurance as well, because people were then thinking, well, that it's not just me that's feeling that way. There are other colleagues in the business that are feeling the same. But it then held us accountable to then actually using that feedback and incorporating it into our plans as well.
I completely agree with both. I think from my point of view and learnings, the example of running through our platform of how are you, a great question. There's 2 flows to that. One is, that's just a what do you feel like? That's a green emoji or a red negative. But then being able to understand why someone feels like via that sentiment analysis, and then how they feel that way through word clouds. So suddenly what was just one single question now gives you outcomes to look at. And then the second point is what Terry and Noosh are saying is, within our platform, it allows the management team to push back to the right parts of the business, that feedback that's anonymous, and allows you to say equally what you're doing about it, or what you're not going to do right now, but you've at least received that and acknowledged that. But that may be part of a bigger piece of the jigsaw that we're thinking about, because the biggest challenge is silence and the gap, where management talk about all these wonderful strategies for months and months and months and think they're about to get to the certain solution. Meanwhile, employees on the front line are going, I've given you a response to my questions and heard nothing for the last 2 months. And that's where the loss of trust comes, and everyone's working to the same outcome and goal. But as Terry and Noosh are saying, it's just keeping that feedback loop, that micro pulse element, that circulation, good and bad. It's okay if the organization feels rubbish, because it's a hard time in our lives. There's children running around, there's businesses closing, there's businesses starting up. It's a hard time. So it's okay to show vulnerability as leadership and say, we're struggling too. We're all not superheroes. It's about remembering that we all have roles and a hierarchy to support that business, but that feedback in and out is really important.
Yeah.
I think there's those experience, I think what you said there about mapping across to what's happened in the news or in the workplace. When you ask people, that's important, because there is context to understand that. Then not to excuse it away, but to understand it. Well, okay, this happened, so we need to help staff with that because it makes them feel a certain way. So I think when you've got to ask people how they think and feel about stuff when it occurs. That helps you map where people are. Maybe another question to ask people is, what do you think's going well, and why has that gone well? And COVID's a challenging time for us all, and no doubt producers, what sometimes happens in surveys, people feel it's an opportunity to get everything off your chest. But there is, through COVID, we've seen employees feel even closer to their employer, feel even more engaged, feeling listened to, feeling valued, because they've said this is an issue, or that their employers asked them what they should do, and they've worked closely together on these things. So I think there's something often in saying, well, what worked well, and then, as giving away no state secrets here, but one of the things that I think employers and bad employers often do is they do something well and think that then gives them carte blanche to do lots of other things badly, instead of that thing they've done well then being the template for how they do it. And the things that didn't go well should always be the template for, well, what do we need to do in this new scenario? Well, we've done this here and it didn't work, so let's do the polar opposite to that kind of thing. So asking staff what worked well, why did it work well, and it will be those things of, you asked me what I felt and thought about it, you listened to me, you followed it up. It wasn't just dated on a spreadsheet. It was you had a conversation with me, you asked me for my ideas, and I feel great because I feel like you've listened to my idea, and I'm now an ambassador almost in the workplace for saying, well, you know what, these managers do care. And unions often do that. Unions will be the first to say if someone's a bad employee, but say where someone's good, and say, you know what, no, these listen, these learn, these work with us and do really progressive things. So I think there is that bit of seeing what's good and understanding that from people.
Brilliant. Listening is key, isn't it? We've got another question from Doug, and this is about pulse surveys. So he's saying about the pulse surveys to employees more than ever over the past few months. What's your advice to prevent survey fatigue creeping in and to ensure consistent engagement? Noose, I can see you're nodding your head there.
Yeah, so we, that was something that I was super conscious of. And I think what we tried to do is, first of all, we kept our pulse surveys really short and we got straight to the point, and we kept them really specific to certain topics as well. And we did a lot of campaigns before we actually launched the survey. So we did one specifically on health and mental health and wellbeing. We did one specifically for our furloughed colleagues to make sure that they stayed connected with the business. As I said, we did a couple on return to work, and so we were really clear what the topic was, and we knew that not everybody was going to respond, but we knew that people who felt particularly passionate about it or had something that they really wanted to share would get involved. And we were actually averaging between about 60 to 70% response rates across all of the pulse surveys. We ran 6 over the kind of the initial period of lockdown. But I think it was just, and again, as Jay alluded to earlier, it was just I think it was mainly driven by the fact that people felt that they had the opportunity to tell us how they were feeling, and the fact that we were asking them how they were feeling. We were asking for their help as well. That's great.
I think from my point of view, Carol, just the mechanism in which that's delivered as well is really important. So like Noosh was saying there, some organisations think of a pulse survey as just speeding up the annual survey vertically with 50 questions to deal with and asking that faster, as opposed to lying those questions down. So if you want to ask 15 questions, potentially you can ask 2 questions a week as opposed to 15 questions a week. And then at the back of that, we found that survey fatigue actually comes in by a poor mechanism of responding to those questions. So if you don't have the right platform in place, you could go to X platform, click on the link, hopefully get there, fill in those questions, and it's taken you half an hour to get through that. What we do is pulse those questions directly into an employee inbox. So with one click, you can respond and it registers that answer automatically. So we take away, a bit like when you buy something on Amazon. Everyone goes to Amazon because it's so quick to choose, buy, and speak. And that's how employee feedback should be. It should be one-click conversation, one-click voice that they can be heard, can be said, and move on with their day-to-day. And the moment you have barriers, that's when you start to get answers that may not be true or are just answered for the sake of it. And you see a large spike at the top. And what happens is employers start to try and incentivize to get to 80% and put great incentives to keep that retention up. But you would rather have 10% of your employee voice speaking honestly to you to do something about that quickly than you would have 100% for getting X number of days for holiday for keeping an engagement score up. So I think it's really important how you deliver, like Nusha's done there, kind of get your frequency right. Think about that. You don't necessarily need, if you ask the right 1, 2, 3, 4 questions, you shouldn't need to ask 15, because the way you ask them and the way you can drill down that data should all be presented on the right mechanism for you.
Yeah, and that's one of the questions that, in terms of that feedback as well. That's another question that we've had as well, is around experiencing how you feedback to colleagues from the chats or surveys, how that's distributed, you know, how you send and receive that feedback, and do you share pulse survey results with all colleagues? You know, so it's obviously something that a lot of people are thinking about at the moment.
Yeah, we made a point of making sure that after every pulse survey, we shared the results back out to the business in a, this is exactly what you told us. And then on the back of that, this is what we're going to do about it. And if we can't do anything about it, this is why we can't do anything about it. And I think that in itself also drove completion rates for the remainder of the surveys, because people could see that we were being transparent about what they were telling us, but they could also see how it was then being used to inform the plans going forward as well.
Yeah. We've got another question as well from Chris that that Jay and Terry might be able to help with here as well. Many organisations have staff who are employed by subcontracted or outsourced organisations. Should the main organisation listen and respond to their voices too? And if so, how?
Do you want me to start? Oh, you want to start with that?
Go on. No, Terry, I'll let you go first, mate, and I'll just copy your answer. Go on.
No. I know you will have a particular view come from your viewpoint. But I think if you've got people in your workplace who are going to impact on that workplace, you probably want to understand. Because if you just cut them out, if they just say, well, you know, like say, for example, oh, well, they're just agency staff. Well, yeah, they are, but they're not. They're in your workplace. They're affecting your product. They're affecting your business. They're affecting the colleagues that you directly employ. So I think you know, you need to think it through, but I would say don't just see them as other, because they're not. They're in your workplace. They're making a difference, and probably you want to understand what's going on. So I think if it, you know, pulse surveys, I mean, you probably give these people email addresses, you give these people uniforms, you give these people keys to the building. So why wouldn't you want to kind of understand perhaps what's going on in terms of their experience? Now, there might be things that they tell you about that you don't have any control over. Say, for example, they turn around and say, well, my wages are pretty lousy because they may be getting paid from somewhere else. But there are other things that they will be able to tell you about. So I would probably turn around and say, yeah, you need to think about how you might cover those people too.
That's great. And Jay?
If you're an employer, whether you employ anyone, you know, directly or indirectly, you should want to know what they're thinking and feeling, good or bad, because that will help you inform the decisions you make. And you know, the example I'd give on this, and while it's not employee voice, does show the importance of how outsourced workers can be. KPMG speak really positively of the real living wage. They, you know, won't come as any surprise to know that most of, if not all of their directly employed staff were paid well above the real living wage, as we'd expect. But they had cleaners in many of their offices who were outsourced, maybe only in for a couple of hours a day, who were paid below the real living wage rate. They made a conscious decision to pay them the real living wage, and they have noticed improvements in not only productivity of the cleaners, but just a morale thing, and that those cleaners are almost advocates for that business now. Even if they're not directly employed, even if they only clean there, they are ambassadors and advocates for KPMG. You listening to those staff, you know, it might be that you can have a conversation with them, and this is the other side to this, you know, outsourced work. You know, unions do have a strong position on this, but I often think there's one of the things we don't do with staff enough is talk to them about, you know, well, how would you do the job? You know, often staff will have opinions about how this is done. I worked in a job centre, of course, we had opinions about how the job centre or benefit system should work. But there is a need, I think, to engage with them. So maybe that might be, well, you know, you don't need to have us outsourced because we do this, or maybe we could do this different. They are your staff, ultimately, even if you don't directly employ them and they're not sat always in the same office in your eye line. They are representing you. You should want to know and think what they're feeling. And I think maybe that should be something you can put in your contract and on your commissioning, is that, you know, you'll share these surveys. Maybe there'll be a specific survey for outsourced workers or agency workers. Maybe that's a way you can break the survey down to try and understand, well, is there is there an issue with how agency staff maybe think or feel, or outsourced staff versus our directly employed? Is that going to become a problem for us? Can we do something different? Using that data always then to be, well, at least we know what people think. Now, as Nush and others have said, what can we do with it? What do we do with it to make a real difference? And I think, you know, and the employment charter is this, that word will get out of good employment, and how that employer or that manager listens, that word gets out, because people tell good stories as much as they tell the bad ones. It's just that too often we only pay attention to the bad ones. So we need more of those good stories, and good practice like that would be really good.
Yeah, and I think it is really interesting, that point about, you know, those staff that are, you know, kind of subcontracted or outsourced organisations, they are also representing your organisation as well. So as you both said, they should be treated as part of your integral workforce as well. Why treat them any differently? They should be living your values as well, shouldn't they? Which is what it's all about. I'm just conscious that we are getting close to the time that we should be finishing. I'm just going to shout out if anybody's got any last and final questions. We have had a couple of people, Michael, that are interested in having conversations with you about the app that you have. Is it suitable for the charity sector, for example? We've had that. So are you comfortable, obviously, with us to kind of share your details directly with those organisations? But we'll be sending general information out anyway with all of our communications after this event. But I think we've had some interesting comments and some questions raised so far this afternoon. I think Donald's right in that he's saying about nothing beats one-to-one chats and having those frequently as well. And I think that even though we are all working differently at the moment, you know, we can still have those. I think it's just being a bit smarter as well in terms of how we can do those, because I'm conscious that sometimes we can't always pick up on some of that body language as well that we used to see when we were all together in the offices or in our key locations. But the key messages coming out from this are about working together with managers and the workforce and building that trust, really, isn't it? And if you can do that and you can get it right and you act upon that feedback, that's where you obviously can demonstrate a very effective employee voice and engagement, which obviously has huge benefits for the organisation. So given that we've gone 5 minutes over time, which is not too bad, I'm just going to thank everybody for your time this afternoon. I hope you found it enjoyable, and it's brightened up a dreary afternoon, as we've said. And if you've got any further questions, then we can always direct them to our panel afterwards, or if anybody wants any more information. As we've said, this will be this is being videoed and it'll be put onto YouTube so people can watch it afterwards. But just want to thank Terry, Jay, Noose and Michael for being part of this panel this afternoon. It's been really interesting and I've thoroughly enjoyed it as well. So thank you, and hope everybody has a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.